for a really great treat. We have a couple of folks who are really well known in the area and internationally for their knowledge of the topic they'll be talking about, China-U.S. economic relations. First up, I think it's a reversal from the way it's listed, David Shambaugh, who's come from a very, very long distance to be here, at least 3 doors down from my office, 2 from Jay's. So very great to have you here. And after him, Chad Bown, who came across town, I suppose. So thank you very much. You have the bios in your list. Read them as they're speaking if you wish. Otherwise, let's get going. David.
Okay.
Great to have you, and look out for that cord.
Okay, thank you, James. And thanks to the Institute of International Economics on the 5th floor. We are neighbors. I'm in the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, and we share an adjoining door with the IIE. So we're kind of siblings, I guess. But delighted to be asked to speak to this 11th? 12th. This is the 12th. I remember I think I might have spoken to the first one.
The first one, the last speaker.
Yeah, a long time ago. Anyway, delightful to be back. Thanks, everybody, for coming. First thing to say is I'm not an economist, and I don't really study or follow the economic dimension, commercial dimension of U.S.-China relations with much depth or knowledge. I'm a kind of passive observer, I would say. How can you not watch U.S.-China relations and not follow that dimension, or for that matter, the internal economic reform dimension in China? That I try and follow my best, but I have to start with the caveat that I'm not an economist. So what I'm going to do is to discuss what I call the stresses and strains in the U.S.-China relationship, and of which there's certainly no shortage, and we'll do so by trying to describe how I think we got here today into this period of stress and strain, and especially how I think a new consensus in American thinking about China and American policy towards China has emerged. So in my view, there's been a real sea change in American thinking about China, certainly inside the Beltway. Okay, so that's another important caveat. Outside the Beltway, it's different in different parts of the country. I met with someone yesterday, a senior executive who lives and works in Los Angeles and has been intimately involved in U.S.-China commercial exchange. I won't tell you for which company, for many, many years. And I was sort of giving him the inside the Beltway view of China and U.S.-China relations, and he thought I was from Mars. He couldn't understand what I was talking about. And then he sort of gave me his view of the U.S.-China economic relationship from the California perspective. Very different. So that's not unimportant. Those of us who live and work in Washington have to realize that we're in a kind of echo chamber to a certain extent. And so I'm going to try today to give you my sense of how we got to where we are, and to the extent that we do have a new consensus in the United States or in Washington around a toughened China policy, how that's come to pass. Now, let's recall first that this is not the first time, hardly the first time, that we've had extreme stresses and strains in U.S.-China relations. It's recall 1989, June 4th, and the aftermath of that, including the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party's paranoia about American subversion during that period and other periods. Actually, they've been paranoid about American subversion going back to 1955. And John Foster Dulles' testimony in front of Congress when he used the word 和平演变, peaceful evolution. So that's not unimportant either. We Americans need to understand how the Chinese look at us and through what prisms. One prism they have always looked at us through is the subversion prism. Okay, they think we are out to undermine and overthrow their regime through 和平演变 and other means. So I'm not sure Americans really know that, but that's how they see us. Anyway, so we had June 4th, we had the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crises, We had the 1997 Belgrade bombing, the American bombing, I should say, of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. We had the 2001 EP3 incident and others. So the current period of stress and strain is hardly the first. But what's different this time, I think, is that it's not, the stresses and the strains in the relationship are not event-induced. Each of those previous occasions I just mentioned, there was a trigger, there was a catalyst event that triggered the stresses, strains, fallout. This time, in my view, it's a culmination of many issues over a substantial period of time, a decade or so, that have coalesced over the last couple years and have produced a debate, an ongoing debate, which is very good, very healthy, very appropriate for a democracy. That's how policy should get made, including foreign policy in democracies, is through civic participation. So this China policy debate that I'm going to tell you, that I'm going to sketch out for you, that I think is ongoing, is a good thing. It hasn't come to complete consensus. There are identifiable threads or factions, you might call them, in this debate, which I'll sketch for you in a second. But let me just observe at the beginning that Trump is not, in my view, the reason for the stresses and the strains. He's added to it, and his trade war in particular, tariff war, I think it's more appropriate to call. I don't know if an economist would call what we're in now a trade war. I don't think so. It's a tariff war, to be sure. Could lead to a trade war, but that's a technical issue we can come back to. But what he did, or has done, is to tap into what I would argue has been a progressive disenchantment in several sectors in the United States towards China during his campaign, and then in the last 3 years now. But the U.S.-China relationship has sort of been adrift, you might say, for some time, which is to say it hasn't had any kind of central glue, really, since the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union. To the extent that we've held the relationship together, there have been several sources of that. First, I would say the American belief in so-called engagement with China. Secondly, a belief that that engagement was both good for the United States, but very importantly, would produce a liberalization of China. I repeat, a liberalization of China, an economic liberalization, a social liberalization, and a political liberalization. That was the underlying assumption of the engagement approach across 8 American administrations up until this one. That kept the ship going ahead, you might say. The Chinese need for the American market, American technology, and training of Chinese students in American universities and other professional training, that kept the ship going ahead. The interdependence between our two societies at all levels, that has been the ballast of the relationship during times of friction, very important times. All those times I just mentioned, why didn't the relationship unravel and fall apart? Well, because of the engagement, frankly, and the interconnectivity between our two societies. And then the last thing that has kept, you might say, the ship afloat has been the American belief in Chinese integration into the international system. These, as Robert Zellick once called it, the responsible international stakeholder approach. Get China embedded institutionally in a whole range of multilateral organizations. So, as I say, over 8 administrations, those kinds of guiding policy principles has kept the U.S.-China relationship from falling apart when it was previously stressed. So it's currently very stressed. So how does this come about? How do I see it, at least? I'm just one observer. My specialty actually is Chinese politics, not American politics, but I'm going to talk to you about American politics. So not long after Trump enters office, beginning in the summer of 2018, a vigorous debate about China policy has erupted in this city. is like a pressure cooker that had just been building pressure and finally exploded at the beginning of his administration. But throughout, one argument I would make is that throughout the Obama administration, the relationship was in steady deterioration. It is the only country in Asia with which American relations did not improve during the Obama administration. It declined. North Korea didn't improve, but it didn't get worse either. But so that was 8 years of Obama, and I would argue growing frustration across multiple constituencies. Frustration and disenchantment across multiple constituencies. So I understand the current hardening of U.S.-China policy really, as I say, from the inside out and from the bottom up in our society. Yes, the Chinese have certainly done their part to contribute to these stresses and strains, particularly in the decade since 2009, and particularly since Xi Jinping became the supreme leader in 2012. But that's a factual point. The repression and the assertive behavior externally that China has exhibited began before, 3 years before, Xi Jinping became the top leader. Started in 2009. I was actually living in China that year, so you could feel it, see it. Anyway, I see this as a constituency-driven process. So the American military and security community have long been concerned about China's military modernization and expanding footprint in the Asia-Pacific, increasingly in the Indo-Pacific, and increasingly in other parts of the world. The Chinese Navy is now undertaking exercises in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic Sea. And pretty soon it's going to be in the Caribbean and on the Potomac River. I don't know. But no, quite seriously, that's not a new concern for the American military. China's growing footprint, and then what we saw rolling down Chang'an Boulevard on October 1st, a few weeks ago, only fuels those concerns from the American perspective. John Holden and I were 10 years ago at that parade together, watching that generation of missiles. So the American security community has long been concerned about China. That's not new news. Foreign NGOs have had difficulty in China, but substantially increased difficulty since the passage of the, 2017 NGO law, which made them all re-register. They were all inspected, made life very difficult for foreign NGOs to operate in China. They've shrunk from something like 16,000 down to, I think it's 1,500 registered foreign NGOs. In the last 2 years, 16,000 to 1,600 registered. Of the 1,600 that are registered, you know, everybody has their own estimate, but not more than a few hundred are really active in China. To be registered doesn't mean you're actually working. So the NGO community, broadly speaking, whether you're Greenpeace or the Nature Conservancy or Amnesty International or whoever, really is having a very hard time in China. So they've gotten alienated. Academic world, I have to say, has gotten progressively alienated because we don't have access to doing normal academic research in archives, with interviews, with field work in situ. That means living in a village or working in a factory or, you know, for a prolonged period of time. Things that we used to be able to do, Chinese have circumscribed at a minimum, if not cut off altogether. So doing research, I can tell you as an academic, really tough in China today, if you're a social scientist. China's internal security services have become increasingly effective, shall we say, in their surveillance of foreigners and Americans inside of China. Visas have been denied for various Americans and foreigners now for several years going to China. Now the U.S. government is actually retaliating by denying Chinese visas coming this way. What do I think about this issue? I think it's terrible. I think it's a race to the bottom. No side wins a visa war. We all lose. So both sides need to step back and open up. But the point is the academic world has found increasing difficulties. And the business community, not the least of which, has been frustrated for many years with various barriers of operating inside of China. They've complained to multiple American administrations about it. They've complained to the WTO about it. And the Chinese just have not accommodated their concerns. Hence, you get the Lighthizer approach and the Trump approach, which actually are two different, well, I don't know, I don't want to go there. They're obviously on one team, but Trump wants a reduction of the trade, the number, right, the trade deficit. Lighthizer wants major systemic reform of the Chinese economy. So we'll see, to the extent everybody's worried that Trump will take a number and leave Lighthizer out dangling like he leaves other people out dangling, and take a deal that doesn't require systemic change of the Chinese economy. Anyway, the business community, I would argue, and I defer to those in the audience who actually are in the American business community, they've had enough. They just got fed up. Years and years of frustration finally bubbled over and joined. They were really the last constituency to fall, you might say, into place. And so as a result, as I say, this has been a kind of bottom-up, cross-constituency process in the United States. There are other contributing aspects: technology theft, IPR theft, and other types of espionage, cyber espionage in particular, harassment of Chinese citizens in the United States, constraining freedom of speech in the United States, on American campuses, and with American companies, Exhibit A, NBA. But NBA is hardly unusual in this regard. So a lot of things have happened. And then so-called influence activities, that's a kind of new issue. Belt and Road Initiative. The Americans, I think, incorrectly view that in a threatening light, the Trump administration. But that's a complicated subject. There are pros and cons to the Belt and Road. The point is that China policy has moved. It's toughened, it's hardened, it's had a rethink, we've had a gestalt, you might call it, and it's produced a much more robust, tougher approach to China. And as I say, the reason is it's bottom up, and it's across both parties. Just look at the legislation in Congress. There's something, I think like 12 or 13 bills pending at present. Look at the co-sponsors of those China bills. Democrats and Republicans together. Rubio on one hand, John Cornyn on the other, Elizabeth Warren and Schumer on one, with Patrick Leahy and other Republicans on the other. So there's a bipartisan, cross-aisle consensus that the U.S. needs to really get tough with China. And so we are. The FBI director, Wray, calls this a need for a whole of society approach to China, not just a whole of government. FBI says it's universities, it's labs, it's companies, it's NGOs, it's communities, it's state legislatures, governors, mayors, everybody. And maybe he's a little exaggerated in his approach, but anyway, that's what the director of the FBI says. Okay, so. Sorry. So in this atmosphere, there has been a considerable reevaluation, and I would say partial repudiation of the engagement strategy adopted by previous aid administrations. It's mirrored in the public. Look at the most recent Pew poll in October. Look at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll in August. Both show substantial majorities. 2/3 of Americans have a distrust or an unfavorable view of China today. That's a 20% jump over the last 2 years. And if you look at it actually even longer period of time, over 6 years, there's been a secular decline in favorable American views of China. So this is not just inside the Beltway. It's not just between Democrats and Republicans. It's mirrored outside the Beltway. So if there is a general consensus towards getting tougher with China, is it a complete consensus? And the answer there is no, it's not. It's like everything else in American democracy. It's debated. Some of you might have read the so-called open letter published in the Washington Post in July by over 100 former American officials and China specialists who laid out 7-point critique of the Trump administration. 6 of the 7 points were laid at the door of the Trump administration for the deterioration of U.S.-China relations. They lament, these 100 people, now almost more than 100 have signed it, lament the deterioration of the relationship, and they say it's the American side that has done this. 6 of the 7 points. The first one is China, but it's kind of a throwaway point so they can get on to their other 6. So they don't agree with what I've just described about an emerging I don't want to call it an anti-China consensus, that's not it. And I want to be really clear that it's not Chinese people, which the United States, or Chinese institutions, partners with whom we have worked for decades, with which the Americans are upset. It's the Chinese party state and military and security services. That they are the problem from the American point of view. Okay, so the open letter I mentioned because there are a significant group of very well-respected Americans who have served multiple administrations, different parties. They're very experienced, and they have their view. Not everybody signed their open letter. A number of us did not. So where are we today? Let me just conclude for sake of time. So if that's the kind of current zeitgeist here inside the Beltway, at least, or in the country, where do we go from here? I have put forward in a few other places, the competition theory. I'm of the view that the U.S.-China relationship is now in an indefinite period of comprehensive competition. Get used to it. There's no going back to the kind of harmonious, cooperative engagement kind of relationship that we've tried for. I wouldn't say we've really ever had since 1989. We Americans have tried for it. But it is predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly now a competitive relationship, comprehensive across all functional spheres and all geographic regions of the world. Yes, Latin America, Caribbean, Western Europe, Central Europe, Africa, Asia, certainly, Middle East. Why? Because China is now a global actor. The United States has been in these places for a long time. China is now bumping up against the United States in these other regions. So that's the predominant trend. Yes, it means it's not exclusive because there is still scope for some U.S.-China cooperation. Where? I would argue in global governance issues. Okay, beginning with climate change, beginning with non-proliferation, including Iran and North Korea in that category, counterterrorism, anti-piracy issues, public health issues, and pandemics, a lot of stuff in which the U.S. and China should be working together on. There are also bilateral elements, including commercial, academic elements we should be working together on. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that a competitive relationship is an exclusively competitive one, nor is it a so let me be clear. Competition, in my view, is not confrontation, and it is not containment. Different things. Competition is competition. What's wrong with competition? It's in our DNA. We love to, competition of ideas in the academic marketplace, competition of goods and services and businesses in the commercial marketplace, competition geostrategically. That's what countries do. So the U.S. is getting competitive with China and vice versa. So that's the new normal. It's going to play out, as I say, in high tech, in FDI, Chinese FDI into the United States. It's going to play out in the academic sphere, in the espionage sphere, the so-called influence activity sphere, export controls, the security, military balance in the Western Pacific, and public diplomacy, a lot of areas. So I think, the friction, two things we need to get used to: a toughened American policy, and had Hillary Clinton been elected, I am sure we would have seen a toughened American policy anyway. May not have gone down the tariff route, but we're going to see that continued, and we're going to see continued friction continued. So that's kind of the new normal. It's not great news, but I think we need to kind of recognize where it is and why it's happened. The Chinese, I'll just close on this point, they're flummoxed. They don't, from my conversations with them, understand why this sea change has occurred in the United States. They're really shocked and they're confused. Well, their America watchers haven't been doing their job. They should be having a big debate in Beijing about who lost America. They didn't see it coming. Why? Because they don't really understand democracies. They don't really understand civil society. They don't really understand the role of media and social media and all the things that have produced this sea change in the United States. Those America watchers are fixated on the president, on institutions, and this has been a different situation. So I can't say the American China watchers have necessarily understood exactly what's going on across the Pacific that well either, but so maybe we have a perception, we have a kind of gap in perception and expertise there. So I'll stop. Sorry to run over a little bit, James, but
Thank you so much.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Chad. I used to be an economist. Now I just play one on a podcast.
a recovering economy.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about, obviously, is U.S.-China, a bit on the economic side. I'm going to try to explain what's happened in terms of the data, not necessarily why. I agree there's a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of uncertainty of why we're doing this, how we're doing this, that kind of thing. But what I want to try to do is to put a bunch of facts on the table as to what's been happening so far, what I see, at least in terms of the economics and the rules of international trade, especially what some of the challenges are in the relationship. And then if we have time at the end, I'll put forward some potential fixes to dealing with these concerns if you're interested in doing this in a rules-based way, but at the same time acknowledging that it's not trivial and that this stuff is really, really hard. Now, before I start, thank you to GW for the invitation to be here, and it is amazing to see a crowd of this size. 2 weeks ago, I was in Geneva at the World Trade Organization for the big annual event that they do called the Public Forum. And the Public Forum, they cover everything involved with trade, right? So this year they were stressing a lot about technology and services and millennials. Do we have any millennials here? Apparently you all are the future. So they were stressing that a lot. But they did have this one panel about China and the challenges that China poses to the international trading system. But they stuck it. So there's 10 or 12 concurrent sessions going on at the same time. They stuck it in the smallest room of the World Trade Organization. And the size of the crowd was, your size or double, and it was out the door, down the hall, around the corner. They didn't know what to do. Well, they ultimately found for us the biggest one. But my point of that is it's even taken the WTO a while to recognize just how important this issue is, right? They've been very slow to the game of recognizing the conflict. I would argue not just between the United States and China, but that China has posed writ large with the trading system and sort of the international community and in the trade space anyway. Okay, charts. Wow, look at that. Isn't that amazing? So I work at a place that I have amazing colleagues. I just give them numbers and they come up with visual ways of showing these things. So these are tariffs, right? No one has made, I used to think of myself as tariff man before President Trump claimed on Twitter the moniker. So basically this is the story of US and China tariffs toward each other over the last 2 years. So before all of this started, back at the beginning of 2018, US tariffs toward China were about 3%. They're really low. China's tariffs toward the United States were 8%. A bit higher, but still relatively low, much lower than they were in the late 1980s, early 1990s as China was opening up before it became a member of the WTO. Over the last 18, 19, 20 months or so, obviously that's changed dramatically. And so we are right now, the United States is the blue, China is the red. The US average tariff toward China is about 21%, same with China. And sorry, if you see my look at my phone, I promise you I'm not checking Twitter to see if the tariffs have changed since we started, but you do have to check Twitter almost constantly at this stage, right, to figure out what's going on. If the December 15th tariffs go on, and they still haven't been called off yet. There were reports that, well, maybe they're going to actually start rolling back some of these tariffs. None of this stuff is finalized yet. The December 15th ones are still scheduled to go on. China's still scheduled to retaliate. If all of that stuff happens, we'll be up around 25% each, right? Which, in historical perspective from the United States side, is not all that far away from where we were in the 1930s, right? Smoot-Hawley era with respect to China. Now, the major difference between the United States today and the 1930s is the United States is only doing this with respect to China. Our tariffs toward everybody else are still down there at 3% or lower. But in the 1930s, we had tariffs of upwards of 30, 35% or so toward the world. So this is kind of serious stuff. What's been happening? In case you needed any reminder of that. Where we are, look, this one's nice too, right? So this is the amount of trade that's been covered, at least on the United States side, U.S. imports from China, that have been covered by these tariffs over time. So this is dating back historically to 1980 or so. This is special protection, special forms of protection. Now, in the 1980s, it wasn't a trade war. In the 1980s, we had all kinds of special protection on clothing and footwear and those types of products. That's what China was largely into producing and exporting at that point in time. This was something called the multi-fiber arrangement, if you're a historical trade geek. But these had reached very low levels of special protection until recently, and then with President Trump's special tariffs, by September of last year, half of U.S. imports, 50.6, were subject to these special tariffs. We're now over 2/3 of U.S. imports from China are hit with these special tariffs, and this could go almost to everything unless they really do get a decent deal in place with this truce that they're talking about now. My colleagues just do I have to show off some of their artwork. So this is just what this is. So this is just, is there any economic sense with the tariffs that have been imposed, right? And it's hard to make economic sense of it, but I look wherever we can. These were the last two lists, the really big sets of tariffs the United States rolled out both in September and then the ones that are potentially going on in December. And you might ask yourself, well, why did they roll out certain products getting hit with certain tariffs when? So let's look at the blue line, which is the December tariffs. These are the ones that haven't gone on yet, but they could go on December 15th. So the products on this list are things like toys, mobile phones, consumer electronics, all that stuff. This data is the non-seasonally adjusted, so Jay Shambaugh taught me how to seasonally adjust stuff, but this is non-seasonally adjusted data. So this is when it comes in every year. You look and see when do the spikes, when do these things tend to arrive at the docks in the United States each year. Ooh, December 15th, that list of products, that gets here in October. These are essentially all of the toys and consumer electronics that get here for the holidays, right? That consumers go out and buy Black Friday, right, the day after Thanksgiving, or Cyber Monday, the Monday after that. They all have to arrive at the docks in the United States to get to Best Buy or to the Amazon warehouses or wherever in October. So when you say we're going to impose tariffs on December 15th, you're implicitly saying we wanted to make sure we missed that big spike, right, in imports. Same sort, not as big, but the same sort of spike you see in the red list, which was the December 1 list. That was a lot of clothing and sneakers, back to school items, right? And those tend to spike in August every year. So by doing the tariffs then in September, they missed that spike, right? The idea being, if we're going to go through with this trade war, maybe we don't want to hit the American consumers all that hard, or we want to delay the impact that it's ultimately going to have on them, because there we might see some pushback. And I think that's when you're asking the economic question of, where are we now? How did we get here? And why isn't there some major American backlash to the economic side of the U.S.-China trade war at the moment? I think this is part of the explanation, right? If you would have said to an economist 2 years ago, before this all started, in 2 years, we're going to find ourselves with tariffs of 25 to maybe 30% on everything the United States buys from China, right? $500 billion worth of imports, 20% of what we trade with the world. And yet the U.S. economy is still going to be kind of okay, right? Still going to be growing. Financial markets aren't going to have completely freaked out. I think economists would have said, oh, that sounds, I don't know, do our models predict that? Turns out our models kind of do predict that, but I think we didn't know that they predicted that at the time, and we would have freaked out. But that's essentially kind of where we are, right? There hasn't been this major negative impact on the American economy, but partially this kind of explains that, or why a lot of people haven't noticed stuff yet. It's sort of some of in the rollout of how they've done these tariffs. And so this next chart is basically just, look at that. There's no way you can see these things. I just want to show pretty pictures with colors and things up there. But this is basically to say that the next sets of tariffs are on toys, and the last ones were on footwear and things like that. So there is, you don't want to say that there's a strategy behind the trade war, but when you're trying to map what they have done, the administration has done with economic impact stuff, you know, some of it can kind of make sense, at least on the economic side. Is this actually having an impact, though, on economic activity? So this is U.S. imports from China relative to imports from the rest of the world. That's ROW. Yeah, right? So they've been decreasing steadily, you know, since the tariffs started going on last year, right? So this certainly is having an impact on China's exports to the United States. Now, what I'm not showing you here is China's exports to the rest of the world, which have continued to go up, right? And so we're just seeing a lot of arbitrage out there, just moving around of trade to other markets in response to all of this. So that was what the U.S. was doing, but now let's look at a little bit more depth on what China's doing in terms of its own tariffs. The red line here is basically a replication of that very first chart. That's China's tariffs on the United States. They started at about 8% before the trade war, and they're now, you know, heading up. They're at 21 something and getting close to 25, 26%. But the blue line down here is China's tariffs toward the rest of the world during the trade war, during the same period of time. We know how the United States has been behaving toward other countries under the Trump administration, not making a lot of friends, right? Imposing tariffs, national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, threatening tariffs on cars, making it really difficult to negotiate the NAFTA agreement with Canada and Mexico. How's China been treating everybody else? Has it been going after them with, no, just the opposite, right? China's actually been lowering their tariffs toward the rest of the world during the same period, during the trade war. Now, if you're an economist, you look at that and you say, that makes sense to me, right? Tariffs are a tax, right? They impose costs on consumers. So one way to offset the cost of the Chinese government is thinking as an economist, they would say, these tariffs that we're imposing on the United States, we have to kind of do some of this stuff to retaliate, but they're actually costly to our own consumers. How do we offset some of the costs to them? Well, we can make it easier for them to find alternative suppliers. So let's lower their costs, lower the tariffs that they would face if they were to buy, instead of from the United States, from Canada, or from Europe, or from Japan, right? So that's some of what they have done. Now, if you're an American company, though, you're kind of being hit twice by all of this. Now you're facing more difficult competitive conditions to work in the Chinese market relative to Chinese firms because of the higher tariffs that you face. But now everybody else in the world is getting lower tariffs into the Chinese market. And so now it's even more difficult for you to compete with, you know, Japanese firms or Korean firms or European firms that are trying to sell in China. And so this is part of the challenge, I think, that the business community is facing in this environment. This is that same trade story from the Chinese perspective. The blue is China's imports from the United States. So yep, they're buying a lot less from us. We saw, you know, this morning, China has been slowing down. So Devine showed us this picture, even dating back to, you know, the earlier 2010s, about their export growth slowing down. On the import side, their import growth has been slowing down as well as their economic growth has slowed down. And so, but you can arguably make the case that some of that has been mitigated by the fact they've been lowering trade barriers to everybody else in the world except the United States, right? So they have continued to import probably more than they would have otherwise. We've got fancy charts to show you where they're lowering tariffs toward everybody else relative to the U.S. So there's going to be a big differential in December if these next rounds of tariffs go on in the automobile sector, right? President Trump puts a lot of emphasis on automobiles. The United States, we actually export, that's one of our biggest exports to China, is in automobiles. Now, it's not the big three. It tends to be these European SUV makers in South Carolina that send a lot of that stuff to China that they like to buy. But China has been lowering their car tariffs toward everybody else as they've been threatening to raise tariffs against the United States. And obviously soybeans is the other big example there as well. So this is just a chart to show you sort of product by product or industry by industry, how much of each of these sectors, how much trade in each of these sectors, so that's what's on the horizontal axis here, the billions or tens of billions of dollars of trade, is now sitting under China's retaliatory tariffs against the United States. But what's interesting here is what they haven't chosen to retaliate over. So remember, part of this story, this trade deficit story, is China actually imports a lot less from the United States than we import from them, than we buy from China. And this is what President Trump's main concern is, or at least the professed one. So when the United States has retaliated over, over $360 billion worth of stuff coming in from China, China could have easily retaliated over everything the United States sends back in return, right? We only export $150 billion worth of stuff to China. They could have done it twice over. There's a ton of products they didn't choose to retaliate over at all. So what are those? Well, aircraft, airplanes. Why? There's not a lot of good other choices out there. I mean, I guess the Europeans make an airplane. But if you've got a whole fleet of Boeing, or half of your fleet is Boeing already, you need those parts, you need to be able to service those things. You don't want to sever that relationship, right? You've got to keep that going. I don't have this really broken. Inside electrical machinery and equipment there's $10 billion worth of stuff that hasn't been retaliated over. It's basically semiconductors, right? So this is, yes, we've got export control stuff on the U.S. side, making it more difficult for Chinese companies to be able to access American technology, but China's not facilitating that by imposing tariffs on those kind of products. They still want our high-tech stuff. That's what they want to buy, right? Okay, so lots of examples like that. Let's talk about the mini deal. So on October 11th, Friday afternoon, and again, I say that with this because I used to be an academic and an economist, and I used to have weekends. But now that I do a podcast, whenever there's giant breaking news, it feels like I'm in the media and have to explain this to the world. So the late Friday afternoon news dump meant I didn't have a weekend. So October 11th, late in the afternoon, the Trump administration says, there's going to be this mini deal with China. Well, they didn't call it a mini deal, but a deal with China upcoming. And they're still negotiating it, and so we're not sure what are in the terms. Oops, sorry, spinning around here. But what do we know so far? So the main thing that happened is there were some tariffs that were scheduled to go on October 15th. Those got canceled, so we're not putting those on. We're not sure still. We're now almost a month later. We're still not sure about the December 15th tariffs. So we'll see what happens with those. If they don't come to agreement on those, on the U.S. side, they're scheduled to be 15% tariffs on $160 billion worth of stuff. And again, this is the iPhone, this is, the game stations and electronics and toys and all that kind of stuff. The statements are that subject to being papered. So this is now a key negotiating term, I guess, being put on paper. China is going to agree to buy a lot of agricultural products, $40 to $50 billion worth over some period of time. We'll see what that means in a minute. Maybe something about financial services. This is an old slide, right? Because watch for the timing, the APEC Leader Summit, which now the Chileans have unrest, and so they've canceled that. And we now don't even know when this thing is going to be or where it's going to be. But the main thing there was a lot not mentioned that they're still working out the details of, which should leave us, I think, a little bit skeptical about there actually being any deal at all, even though the president, I think, clearly wants one. And then what the sustainability of that deal would be, and I'm going to fit very much into David's camp here as well, that this is, even if they come up with some sort of deal, we are now in a whole new world in terms of U.S.-China relations where, you should expect much more friction than kind of getting along. And so it's not clear how long that any deal would be sustainable. This is just some data on, I just did this chart myself, so it's not nearly as nice looking as the other ones. But it's got colors. So what this is U.S. agricultural exports to China over the last 10 years or so. And you see, so this is the context of President Trump said, they're going to buy $40 to $50 billion worth of American farm products, right? Even at our peak in 2012, and this was when, commodity prices were sky high. So farmers were getting as much as they could possibly get out there in the market for their crops. We only sold, a bit more than $25 billion a year to China. And, not most, but a huge chunk of the soybeans that we plant, it's just not clear where this $40 to $50 billion is going to come from. Now, maybe President Trump can say, well, they told me they would buy $40 to $50 billion, and if you farmers can't make it, that's your fault. Or grow it, I guess, but in any case. Left unsaid at the mini deal, right? So there's a lot of, even if we're just thinking about the economic space, forget all of the, human rights, military, all that kind of stuff. There's just a huge number of issues that have now been put on the table because of the administration's actions over the last couple of years. They would have been there otherwise, But these were left unsaid, right? And so we don't know how these things are going to shake out. Obviously, what's been going on in Hong Kong is important. The treatment of Huawei and ZTE, allowing them access. So it's pretty clear that there's not going to be much access for them to be able to sell their equipment into the U.S. market. I think that's been made pretty clear. But what's a little less clear is the extent to which they're going to continue to be able to have access to American parts and components, software, a lot of the stuff that drives their equipment, right? That I think is still up in the air. Right before the announcement of the mini deal, there were 28 new Chinese entities that were put on the entity list that wouldn't have access to American technologies. The U.S. regulatory process is still working out the details of what the future treatment of export controls are going to be. All these new technologies, critical foundational technologies, artificial intelligence, robots, advanced manufacturing, all of this stuff, what that's going to be. This is not only going to affect China, but it's very much looking toward concerns about China. U.S. foreign investment screening procedures. So CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, this is also going to begin to impact on the outbound side, what American companies can do and who they can partner with in China as well. The deal said nothing about industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises, which was one of the core issues at the heart of the trade war, allegedly, in the first place. And I will argue this is actually one of the big challenges that people that work in trade and that think about a rules-based trading system are willing to acknowledge as being critical and something that has to be dealt with. We're not sure yet about what's going to happen with the tariffs. We saw over the last couple of days, it was very interesting. Yesterday, the Chinese government came out with a very forward-leaning announcement that there was agreement there was going to be scaling back of tariffs. President Trump has said that's not been agreed yet. So we're sort of at a stage, if there's going to be an agreement, there will be scaling back of tariffs. Okay, but I guess the question is then, will there be an agreement, right? So, and then the really big question on all of this is enforcement, right? And who it is that is going to be the decider if conflict comes up a month from now, 2 months from now, who it is. What the administration was rolling out as a proposal for enforcement back in April when Ambassador Lighthizer was testifying before Congress revealed just how hard this issue is, but it also revealed that the mechanism that they had in mind was probably not all that sustainable. This mechanism that it would be he that would be the ultimate decider based on anonymous or closed door complaints that the American business community might make that only he might know about and would be able to decide on whether they were worth pursuing or not and enforcing or not, and the mechanism by which those would be enforced. That just seemed to me to be a very unsustainable type of mechanism. All right, so how do we fix this relationship? So let me take my maybe last slide or two and take a step back and say, okay, we can agree that there are some problems here. There have been a lot of criticisms of the Trump administration's approach to dealing with these problems. But suppose we want to acknowledge the problems and we want to try to think about how to fix them. So I think we have settled on, there's a number of rules-based trading system challenges here that are going on, but two of the big ones in particular are this one on industrial subsidies and forced technology transfer, the treatment of foreign investors in the Chinese market. Those are the big ones. Now, there's an approach going on, a non-unilateral or bilateral approach, U.S.-China, trilateral approach at the moment, which doesn't include China, which is the United States, the EU, the Europeans, and Japan, working behind the scenes, kind of thinking about how they might write rules in this area. They started this in December of 2017, so after President Trump had been in office almost a year. They made an announcement that they were working on this issue in Buenos Aires at the WTO Ministerial Conference. They haven't made much public process on this, though they have been basically meeting quarterly, issuing statements saying we're working on this. We expect to release text on, say industrial subsidies very soon. Anyway, there's a path there. Whether or not they want to go down it is another story. There's a lot of reasons why they may not be going down it. They have frictions between themselves at the WTO. The Trump administration is not happy, doesn't like the WTO. It's holding up the appointment of judges at the WTO. China and the United States are fighting other battles at the WTO over whether China is a developing country or not, this issue of special and differential treatment. And the United States is threatening auto tariffs on Europe, right? And so the Europeans are arguing and saying, why should we work with you on China when you're threatening to put car tariffs on us? So in my 30 seconds left, I'm not going to have any time to get into this, but here's my solution. It's in a paper that is with Jennifer Hillman, who's a former WTO appellate body member, so it has to be right. She's actually a lawyer. And so we basically flesh out kind of what we think the issues are, the problems with the existing WTO agreements on this issue of industrial subsidies. So we don't tackle it all in this piece of work, at least the challenges dealing with forced technology transfer. But on the issues of industrial subsidies in China and state-owned enterprises, identify kind of where the current rule book is insufficient and some of the ways that it might be addressed, that it might be tackled. That being said, we are the first also to say that this is not going to be easy. To do it right probably would require major changes in the rules-based trading system, most of which would go in the opposite direction of the way the Trump administration is taking things. It would require the United States kind of ceding more sovereignty to the WTO, sort of like what each European member state has done with Brussels in the Commission, coming up with supranational entities to deal with, you know, some of these big ticket items that just one country alone can't really enforce. China's subsidies are not an America problem, right? It's a market economy problem. It's not an issue that the United States bilaterally can really address. It doesn't have the incentives to want to be able to fix it by itself. That requires ceding kind of more sovereignty to a big international system. That's not really the approach of this administration. Last slide, how do you keep up? Luckily, you have a podcast that you can go to right now, open up your phone, subscribe to it, and this one in particular, this is the work of my then 11-year-old daughters, who kind of they do everything to keep me going during these harrowing trade times. Thank you.
Now, I can tell this audience is very calm and doesn't have anything to say. But let's see if there's any questions out there. I saw you first. Go ahead. Win.
I'm a visiting scholar with the Seeger Center, and I'm from China. I have a question for Professor David Shambaugh. Thank you for your speech. As you mentioned, now the U.S. and China relation competition is comprehensive competitions now. My question is, do you think this comprehensive competition actually is all caused by the two countries' fundamental ideologies, competitions getting more intense with China rising? And if so, do you have any suggestion or solution to ease this intense of the fundamental ideology competition so that we can have more chance to, for two countries have more chance to cooperation rather than just competition and rivals?
So hold that
Thank
thought,
you.
and we'll get a second question. The first one who holds hands up. Way in the back, please. We have a dead mic.
Thank you. I'm Chi Ninh Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans.
Thank you.
I would like to come back to the fact that this is the whole governmental response to the situation that Dr. Shambaugh had brought up before, and also with the enforcement concern that Chad Brown brought up. Do you think the solution for the two countries would base more on economic competition alone? Does geopolitics and other advantage on the leadership, on the global leadership, have a role in it. For example, the influence on nuclear war with North Korea, with Pakistan, with Russia. So how does that play into the grand strategy? Thank you.
Great, fantastic. One more question up front, and then we'll start answering, and then I'll go to the second round. Right in front here. And tell us your name.
Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. A lot of the Chinese imports have very little value added, especially in the tariffs that have been going on. They're trying to like an import of maybe of an iPhone, maybe it costs $300, but the actual Chinese value added may be only a few dollars. So it seems to me that it's a losing proposition for the U.S. that it's not going to hurt China too much because the import will only go to another country and we'll have to pay higher prices. So I wonder if you comment on that. The second thing is the future world has to really combat a climate crisis. So won't this mean definite more cooperation between all the big countries, including China and the U.S., and rather than competition, rather than economic competition, you're going to need social cooperation?
Sure do. Okay, so who wants to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, I think the first and second question actually kind of parallel each other. So let me try and respond to them together. So the first one, you asked about the role of ideology as an element in the U.S.-China competition. So in my personal view, I think ideology has always been a significant factor in U.S.-China competition going back to 1949. You know, but if you talk to realists, beginning with Henry Kissinger and others, ideology has not been an important factor. The American realists have wanted to find pragmatic areas of cooperation with the Chinese side, and they have not been terribly troubled by the ideological component. But I think it's always been under the surface, and particularly on the Chinese side. As I mentioned, John Foster Dulles, you know, that theory of peaceful evolution, the Chinese have long feared, you know, in 1989, and then the collapse, and today is the anniversary of the opening of the Berlin Wall, and then we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. You have to understand, from the Chinese perspective, the ideological/political dimension of relations with the U.S. has always been pretty high on their priority list, I would argue, higher than it has been on the American side, looking at the Chinese. But if you read the most recent speeches by Secretary of State Pompeo and Vice President Pence, ideology figures front and center in both of them. And so this administration, which doesn't really care very much or say about the promotion of democracy worldwide and values, this is not exactly an administration you would say is pushing a value-driven foreign policy. Well, the Pence and the Pompeo speeches are really laden with ideology. So, you know, to answer your question, yes, I think the ideological component is now, again, rising up the agenda, and not on the agenda, but as an explanatory variable for some of the tensions. It's being married together with the problems in all these other areas that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. Now, you also mentioned structural. So I was meaning to myself, but I didn't, so we have to introduce into the conversation the notion of the Thucydides trap. You know, this is classic rising power, established power stuff. That's another thing that's going on here on a broad structural level globally. The second question, our Vietnamese friend talked about global issues. Russia, you mentioned. Yes, the China-Russia partnership, strategic partnership of coordination, they call it, quote unquote. It's not just strategic partnership, coordination. Coordination for what? Well, I think the hidden element there is against the United States is the answer. So yeah, the strategic triangle, we used to call it back in the 70s, the 80s, strategic triangle is back. And this time, it's oriented against the United States. The China-Russia strategic partnership, Putin and Xi Jinping are very simpatico. Xi Jinping calls Putin his best and closest bosom friend, unquote, before the last summit between the two. That doesn't get a lot of attention inside the Beltway here. I think we Americans got to wake up to that factor, the Russia-China relationship. That's in geopolitics. So we have to wake up to the competition for influence in third areas of the world. I've been working a lot in Southeast Asia the last couple of years, where I'm writing and finishing a book on U.S.-China competition in Southeast Asia. It's increasing. And what's happening in Bangkok today, as we meet in the APEC and the EAS meetings, well, Southeast Asia is swinging increasingly towards China. RCEP is now almost finished. That's the Chinese alternative to TPP, some people say. So you're quite right. I think this whole range of geopolitical and structural issues need to be added to what I described in my comments, which were more inside out, constituency-based American issues. So what you've mentioned, I thank you for, both of you, because you've added, this is a bigger, fuller picture of why we're having such difficulties. So.
Excellent, thank you so much.
So just briefly on a couple of those points. So I think that, the Trump administration has done an amazing job at creating a focus of attention on the U.S.-China relationship. To understand, though, whether President Trump himself has a grand strategy, which is, I think, the way you put it, I can't see it. And so there's a separate issue of would the United States maybe have a grand strategy, but for as long as President Trump is president, which could be another 5 years, he is the final decision maker, as we have seen made clear. So and he just has not revealed if he has a grand strategy what that actually would be. So I'm left a bit unclear about that. I agree with the point that he's focused on the bilateral trade imbalance with China. But that's not something that, as an economist, that you can actually fix in any sort of meaningful way. You can deal with it, but trade balances are just going to pop up somewhere else, and it's not going to fix any of the underlying structural issues in the relationship. So it's just bizarre. On climate, I mean, that's a very important point, right? That's an area of cooperation, but the Trump administration hasn't acknowledged climate as a problem that requires the United States to do anything about, let alone the world to do anything about and cooperate over. So while I agree with you intensely that that's required, for as long as this administration is in charge, I don't see that as probably an area of cooperation either. I've seen no signals. And then to the point on global value chains, I agree as well. It's in this day and age, there's a lot of collateral damage with tariffs for that very issue. Right? A lot of the value of the things that we buy from China, that we import from China, is not Chinese stuff. It's parts and components that came in from Japan or Korea, or it's American ideas, embedded in the iPhone, right? And so if you're going to eliminate that trade or make it much more costly because supply chains need to move elsewhere, there are going to be big costs on Americans through the supply chain channel as well, in addition to the cost to consumers.
Great, thank you. Next question right here. I'll get you next.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. 2 questions. First one, who's going to be the better counterpart for President Xi Jinping in the next 4 or 5 years? President Trump or a president from Democrat? Second question, what would be the implication of the conclusion of RCEP for the United States and the U.S.-China trade war? Thank you.
Well, thanks for the short question. Yes, next over here. And give your name, please.
Yeah, Robert Blum. I wanted to address Professor Shambaugh's observation about the misperception on both sides, but there's a link to this ideology issue. The Chinese are, and it could be part and parcel of authoritarianism, they look at U.S. policy making through the lens of their method of policy making. It's top down. So it's like they want to believe our system functions like that. They focus on the president and so on, as if admitting to what it really is kind of admitting, hey, democracy is actually functional. Things do happen in America. It looks like it's top down. That's how we would do it, but it isn't. So, I invoke Machiavelli's dictum that the conqueror actually becomes the conquered. So as soon as you recognize the U.S. is like that, then you sort of accept that this is feasible or doable in China. Now, from the American side, philosophy is not a very respected profession because of its lack of practicality. Americans, like Chinese, are very practicality-oriented philosophy, but philosophy is very important in China. Marxism, Leninism in particular. And in particular, I want to focus on Xi's speech in January on dialectical materialism. All right, and the key component of that is the law of contradiction. And my contention is, first of all, dialectical materialism is, by modern philosophers' judgment, it's from Hegel, it's nonsense.
Make sure you get to your question.
And
yeah.
so the Marxism part is fine. So what they're saying is, first of all, the idea of struggle. It's the whole of society approach to China. This is structural. The China policy. China is like a massive corporation. Everything is decided. It's all organizational and so on. So it's decided. We have this struggle. The other one is to dumb down, to accustom Chinese people to accepting nonsense, contradiction.
So we need questions here rather than assertions. Probably it's usually better.
Yeah,
so
but
do you have a question that follows up on that? One short statement saying, "Here's my question."
Yeah. So my question
Is it right?
It's to comment on that basically. But I
Okay,
think
great.
that,
So a comment on that,
yeah.
we can deal with that. Thank you, sir. And on this side, yes, over on the side. From across the river, please identify yourself.
Hilton George Mason University. So my question is primarily for Chad, though David may also have a comment on this. So you were talking about enforcement and how that's going to be the most difficult issue to make progress on. So to you, what would a viable, credible enforcement policy that could be written into a negotiation? And just having said that, I would say that the U.S. has just signed an agreement with Japan in which there is Article 6 of that agreement is all about consultation as a mechanism for enforcement, because the conception is that even the Japanese don't have a sufficiently robust commercial law capability to enforce. So they're going to do something that has actually been more traditional in our relationship with Asian trading partners, which is this very top-down diplomatic consultation process, and it will be a multi-tiered one. But anyway, I just want to know what you think would be the ideal one from your perspective.
Okay, let's go ahead and answer these, starting with
Chad.
Chad then. Thank you so much.
So enforcement is so hard that I'll point you to the paper for the most part. But it's basically, it's a combination of things. But I don't think that it can happen bilaterally, first of all, because we just don't face all the right incentives. Basically, right now, think of it this way. The United States is fighting, quote unquote, this battle with China on state-owned enterprises to have them become more market-oriented on behalf of the world. Right? If China were to scale back its subsidies, it would be beneficial not just for the United States, but it would be beneficial for European companies. And what that means is we're going to underinvest in that enforcement. We're not going to do enough to scale back the Chinese subsidies. So you need a broader system of enforcement that would be more inclusive of other countries. But that suggests something more akin to probably like what they do in Europe on state aid, something like that. Something that's going to require a lot more transparency to be sustainable. But I will, give the point that it's the hardest issue that there is to think about and to come up with a sustainable solution. On the Xi versus Trump versus person X, I don't have any great insights on that one. But let me say one thing about the implication of the conclusion of RCEP. So I think what we have seen happen, interestingly, around the world, right, over the last 2 or 3 years, is the rest of the world hasn't given in yet to this protectionism, this protectionist impulse by the United States. We saw the chart that I showed you, China lowering its tariffs toward the rest of the world. The Europeans have gone off and signed and implemented trade agreements with Canada, with Japan, major deal, right? A new one with Latin America. Maybe it goes, maybe it doesn't. But in any case, the rest of the world seems to be moving on. Arguably, that's imposing pressure on the White House. right? Because every deal that the United States is not a part of, when two countries lower their tariffs toward each other, by us staying out of that, American companies, American-based production for export is being discriminated against by not being part of that deal. Other companies get a lower tax to get into that market than we do. And arguably some of that's what's put pressure on President Trump to accept these mini deals, right? The deal with China that's just the deal with Japan that's Japan, please buy some of our agriculture that China's not buying. Arguably now some of the pressure to cut a deal with China is to have them buy some of the agricultural products that have been building up in stocks, right? You know, some of that is just the discrimination. So that's what RCEP is. And it's not a big rules deal. It's not it's not as if the Europeans had gone out to Asia and said, we want to impose, geographic indications in our system of a lot of IP stuff on Asia. No, it's a very rules light agreement. But what it just does on the tariff side is it discriminates implicitly against American-based production and export, and it hurts them for that reason.
The couple of minutes we have left, David?
Okay, so let me respond to my friend from Hong Kong's other question about the presidency issue. Not that I can have any insights into who's going to become the next American president, but I don't think it's going to matter a whole lot with respect to China policy. The whole point of my presentation is that this is very constituency-driven, cross-constituencies, cross-aisle, cross-parties, bottom-up, across the country. It's not dependent on one person. Now, obviously, one president can make a difference. Trump makes a difference. I'm not sure Hillary, as I said, would have gone down the tariff path that Trump did. But a Democratic president next, I don't think is going to make a huge difference in China policy. The pressure point, the issue areas in which the American pressure would be brought might shift. Okay, more to human rights, perhaps. But I don't really see a change, necessarily qualitative change, depending on who's elected next. And I guess respond to your question about, American studies in China. As I ended my remarks by observing, I think they've had a major intelligence failure in not understanding the American change in American thinking and American approach and towards China. I wrote my PhD dissertation too many years ago to tell you on American studies in China. America's China Watchers. 40 years ago I wrote that. Here we are 40 years later after training millions of Chinese students in our universities, many in American studies. We've invested institutionally in American studies in China, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Luce Foundation, U.S.A. There's so much capacity building that has gone on over the last 4 decades, yet here we are. Did the Chinese anticipate the Trump administration's China policy? And would they anticipate a Democratic, president's tough China policy? I doubt it. It's not just America, I have to say. I've been in Brussels when the EU got tougher on China back in 2007. The China's Europe specialist didn't see that one coming either. So there's something going on here in analytical dimension inside of China that is a kind of interesting paradox. After all this training and learning about the outside world, is China's government really that well informed about the outside world? I pose that as a question. Then just to finish on your observations about Xi Jinping's recent speeches on Marxism and struggle and so on, you're absolutely right. He's been giving speech after speech about it for several years, but in recent months in particular, the party school speech, I think he used the term dojeng, struggle, 28 times in it. We haven't heard this kind of language since Mao. Jieji dojeng, class struggle was what Mao, Xi doesn't call it class struggle, but there's a bunker mentality. If you read Xi's speeches, including even the fourth plenum recently, there's a kind of bunker mentality in the thinking of the leader and the leadership. So it all goes back to John Foster Dulles, 1955. They feel under assault they think, from outside. What they're really fearful of is being under assault from within. and the outside pressure being married together with the inside pressure. Now, enter the picture, Hong Kong. So I'm not going to go there, but they view Hong Kong very much through that prism. That's why they use this language about Black Hand, the Hay Show. You know, that it's America. It's this organization out there in McLean, Virginia, orchestrating all this. You know, they really, they have a kind of bunker paranoid mentality, I think, and it makes them miss changes in other societies. That's part of what made them miss the changes in American society, I think, in recent years.
Well, on that note, I just want to conclude this session and remind you that we're back here at 3 o'clock. We have some brilliant sessions on industrial policy, technology transfer, and financial access, and the Belt and Road Initiative. I bring this one to a close. Please thank our speakers.